scramble, 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 initial vector, so many degrees, initial altitude, so whatever the altitude was, and the first frequency.
Kilo 2, clear takeoff, left hand. Takeoff left, finish point. Left land, swim west, copy. Crossing 24. Crossing 24 is runway 28, ready for departure. Let's get 24, vector 2, takeoff for good.
Hello and welcome to the Blueskies Podcast. I'm PR Ganapathy, your host. I have the pleasure today of speaking to Group Captain Ajit Agtey, later Captain Ajit Agtey when he moved to airline flying. Veteran of the Indian Air Force, he spent 25 years after being commissioned as a fighter pilot in 1969. Flew many different aircraft, the Gnat, the MiG-21, and the Jaguar, but also as a test pilot did numerous test sorties in all the aircraft in the Air Force fleet. He was also an instructor in Iraq, where he instructed Iraqi Air Force pilots and did some really path-breaking work on a new navigation and attack system for the Jaguar. Very happy to have you here today, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Ganesh. Pleasure to be here. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you and on the topics that you have already mentioned.
That's very nice of you to say, sir. Let's start off by just, diving a little bit into your background. Give us a flavor for where you grew up, what your influences were growing up, what caused you to think of joining the Air Force, and what was that initial journey into the Air Force like?
Okay, so I will take it on right from the beginning. My father was an army officer, an artillery guy. And so I was born literally into the army. And as it normally happens, you move from place to place to place, which you have done yourself. But in the days in the 1940s and 50s, the movements were a little more frequent and they were to places which were really the boondocks. My father had two younger brothers, and both of them were in the Air Force. And I never tire of telling the story as to how I made up my mind to join the Air Force and become a fighter pilot. It all began in 1952. My uncle, that's my father's younger brother, who was a fighter pilot and eventually retired as an Air Vice Marshal back in 1978.
Wow.
He was instructing in Hakimpet in 1952. And June of 52, King George VI had passed away. And he was the King Emperor of India. So there was a memorial service for him and a memorial flypast in Delhi, for which my uncle had gone. My father was at that time posted in Jabalpur. And on the way back, my uncle landed in Jabalpur and stayed the night. So next day, we all got into the car to go and see him off. And there he changed into his flying suit and he zipped it up. I was so impressed. We'd never seen zippers. Today's kids grow up with zippers, but in 1950, 52, zippers, etc., were simply not available. And then he changed into his flying suit, got into that aircraft. He put me in the cockpit, and I still remember the distinct smell of 100 octane petrol and glycol. I still remember those smells.
What aircraft was that?
He'd got into a Harvard, a T6,
Uh,
and he started up that great big radial engine and ran it up, and he eventually took off. And we got into the car and came back. And about an hour later, my dad looks at the watch and he says he must have landed in Begumpet. And I knew exactly at that time what I wanted to do. And that's exactly what I did. I never looked the other way. I had no plan B, and I worked towards it. And in due course, joined the NDA and flying college, and there I was.
wow, that's amazing. And which aircraft did you train on it?
Okay, we started our training as it was at that time in the late 1960s on the HT2. The HT2 was a tail dragger and it had a Blackburn Cirrus Major engine. It was an all metal aircraft and a fully aerobatic aircraft. And it was a delightful aircraft to fly and prone to swinging.
Right,
And it had a freely castering tail wheel, so everybody normally swung on that aircraft. And from we did 40 hours on that aircraft, of which I think 25 hours were dual and 15 solo. And from there we graduated and went on to fly the Harvard. Actually, we flew the T6 version of it, which was called the Texan.
right.
So the flying on HT2 was done at Bidar, and from Bidar we went to Jodhpur to Air Force Flying College, where we flew the T6, and we flew 85 hours on the T6, and that was delightful, absolutely delightful. It was one of the best trainers ever all over the world, and I don't remember how many, but almost all the air forces which had British and American influence flew the Howard.
Right.
From there, we trained on the Vampire, and we flew 75 hours on the Vampire.
You came back to Hakimpet for the Vampire.
Yes, we came to Hakimpet for the Vampire, and we flew 75 hours on the Vampire, and so a total training time of 200 hours, which lasted 1.5 years. And at the end of the Vampire training, we were all commissioned as pilot officers. And
Wow.
lo and behold, on commissioning, as a batch, we got posted to Jamnagar to OTU to fly the Hunter. Now, that was the first real contemporary fighter that we flew, because the Vampire was past its prime when we flew the Vampire, but the Hunter was still very much the backbone of the Indian Air Force's fighting fleet. And so we flew for 40 hours on the Hunter. And after that, we got posted to our respective squadrons. I went to number 2 squadron and flew the Gnat. So that was my training, which as a cadet, we flew three types: the HT2, the Harvard, and the Vampire. And as pilot officers, we did 6 months, 40 hours on the Hunter, and then came to Nats.
Almost every pilot I've met who's flown the Hunter counts it among their favorite aircraft because of the beautifully harmonized controls and yes, how wonderful it was to fly. I, I'm presuming the Hunter holds a special place in your heart too.
It does. In fact, when you look at a picture of a Hunter, there is not a single person anywhere in the world who will say, "What a beautiful looking aircraft." She looks an absolute beauty. And it is a large aircraft also. And her flying qualities are simply superb. And she's got such a wide track undercarriage that I still remember a movie clip somewhere, I don't remember where, but there was a old gentleman called Bill Bedford. And Bill Bedford was a Hawker test pilot. He said, "You look at the Hunter with its broad track undercarriage, he's the most agricultural person who will be able to fly it with no effort whatsoever." So Hunter was a delightful aeroplane. She was so light on the controls, beautifully harmonized, and we did 40 hours, but that 40 hours comprised of a lot of armament work, guns, rockets, bombs, and so on. And it was a it was a beautiful firing platform, besides being a delightful aircraft to fly. And it carried four 30 millimeter cannon. Everybody who's used the aircraft sitting in the cockpit of the Hunter says, "You fire four guns on the Hunter and nothing in front of you can escape it." And here I will quote a Pakistani author. I think it was Kaisar Tufail who wrote about Mami Bhardwaj in 1971 when he shot down the aircraft. His exact words were, he says, "Bhardwaj fired one burst and nothing escapes the four guns of a Hunter."
Wow, that's very
So the
true.
Hunter is a beautiful aircraft to fly. But from there, we went to fly the Gnat. And unbelievable as it may sound, the Gnat was an even more delightful aircraft to fly. And the Gnat in the Indian Air Force had no trainers. So the first flight had to be on the fighter. I mean, there were no
Wow.
trainers. And the Air Force had said, you do use the hunter trainer as a trainer for the Gnat. Now, can you imagine a hunter trainer as a trainer for the Gnat? It simply didn't serve the purpose.
Right.
And so we flew the Gnat.
Did you do some high speed taxiing before your first flight and get used to the aircraft on the ground before getting airborne?
Yes, but I must give you a little background. We were 10 of us posted to number 2 squadron, and the squadron commander was a gentleman called Wing Commander Johnny Green. Johnny Green was already a legend in the Air Force when we were posted there. He
Right.
lined us all up in the office. Those days, flying was difficult to come by. Serviceability in Nat squadrons was not too good, and serviceability of hunter trainers was even worse. So he lined us 10 guys up there. He says the syllabus says 4 sorties on the hunter trainer. He says 4 into 10 is 40. Whole of Western Air Command cannot give you 40 hours, full stop. So he said, one is what you will get. One sortie, that's only to get you back currency into flying. So he said, 5 guys here, Halwara, the other 5, Hindon. 20 squadron commanded by Nosy Parker was in Hinton, and 27 squadron in Halwara, which was commanded by Mia Niranjan Singh. He says, I will speak to these gentlemen. They'll give you 1 sortie each. Go do that, come back, and we'll fly the Gnat. So that's exactly what I did. We went to Hindon. The OC flying over there, who's now called the Chief Operations Officer, used to be a gentleman called Wing Commander K.K. Malik, fondly called Nimbu Malik. And so Nimbu Malik was ex-CO2 squadron. In fact, he had handed over command to Johnny Green. He said, so you've come for a dual check. Let's fly. So he flew up with me in the evening. He said, how have you come? I told him I've come on a motorcycle. So drive through the night, tomorrow go solo and give me a call. I was horrified. He said, so I won't. I drive only in the morning. He said, okay, tonight, tomorrow. So that's exactly what we did. So the two things
Wow.
they did was, one was they asked you to accelerate up to 90 knots. Why 90? A magic figure, because the airspeed indicator on the old Mark 1 Gnat used to come to a stop at 74 knots. So the speed started registering only when you were
You
above
have to.
74 knots. And the moment it went to 90, you pull the throttle back.
Oh my
The
goodness.
other thing they did, you accelerated to about 90 knots and then you brought the aircraft to a stop. And the second thing they did was they put 2 men on the tail plane and raised the nose to take off attitude. And they said, look, guys, this is your takeoff attitude, and this is the same attitude at which you come back and land.
Fascinating. So it gives you the sight picture that you're looking for.
That's about it. But as pilot officers, who the devil knew of any such thing? We just knew, okay, you were pointing that much up, and that's about it. Our total flying experience was 240 hours. 200 on training aircraft, HT2, Harvard, and Vampire, 40 hours on the Hunter. And there we were. And so we lined up and took off. Now, the Gnat, compared to the Hunter, had a whole heap of things which a average standard fighter had. Like a Hunter had anti-skid units on its brakes. There was no such thing as anti-skid units on Gnat brakes. So if you sat on the brakes a little too much, the tire would burst. That's about it. Then
Wow.
when you accelerated on a Vampire or a Hunter, the aircraft went straight as an arrow. For the first time, we were told that there was something called bent thrust. Bent thrust in the sense that the thrust was not completely aligned with the fore and aft axis. So when you
Oh my
started
goodness.
accelerating, the aircraft would run in either to the left or right. You had to keep her straight. And if it became too bad, they would put something called trimmers in the jet pipe. The trimmers were put depending upon how much the aircraft had a tendency to run off to either one side. And rumor has it that they gave these first solo guys a guys with a little bit of bent thrust. But fortunately, we had a CEO who made sure we got an aircraft which went straight. And so you just lined up and took off. And lots of people used to say, don't take off with full thrust and the rest of it because she accelerates too fast. To give you an idea, a clean Gnat, that is the one without stores and drop tanks, would climb from wheels roll to 40,000 feet in 4 minutes 15 seconds.
Oh
That
my
was the
goodness.
average rate of climb. But the distance out was 22 and a half miles. So one of the sorties and conversion later on was just this. You took off and climbed straight. You just didn't turn till 40,000 feet. And you could actually look over your shoulder at the back and you could see the runway behind.
Oh my goodness.
It was such a delightful aircraft.
And I didn't ask you this, but where was 2 Squadron at the time? Where were you based?
The squadron was located at Ambala.
Oh, in Ambala. Okay.
It was at Ambala.
And so from 40,000 feet, you could see the snow-capped peaks and
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. All that you could see. But the best part was you accelerated, and there was a town called Rajpura. You went up there, you were just at Rajpura when you looked over your shoulder and you could see the runway behind you. So it was a sheer delight. And the feeling you got was that you've actually strapped the aircraft onto your back.
right, it's like a little backpack.
Yeah, it was just like a little backpack you'd strapped in. And to give some little snippets about a Gnat, there was no step ladder to get into the cockpit. You had to catch hold of the side of the cockpit, jump, put your knees on the cockpit railing, and then vault into the cockpit. And that's the way you got into the cockpit.
Oh my
And
goodness.
when you, yeah, and your sitting height strapped in was about the same as your standing height outside. So it was that low. And the jet pipe was all of 8 inches off the ground. You held up one span like this, that's how much it was. And the fear everybody had was that while coming into land, if you flared too much, you'll touch. It never happened. It never happened to anybody in the entire Nat flying. If you raise the attitude too much, you just climb away and go. So it was really a delightful aeroplane to have. And the systems were very, very, very simple.
And which year was this?
70, 1970. So July of 1970, we
Uh-huh.
got posted in
Right.
and we started flying. And a CEO like Johnny Green who said, you guys will progress and have to move forward. And there were 10 of us. Before 10 of us could all start flying, a couple of guys got posted out to MiG-21 and Su-7 conversions. So we were all of 4 guys left behind. And we just raced through our syllabus.
Huh.
And it is unbelievable, but a large number of people find it difficult to fathom. We were fully ops, 2 aircraft leaders as pilot officers. You couldn't have done it any faster than that. It
Oh,
simply was not possible.
that is just exceptional.
It was exceptional. And it was great fun, where you walked into the bar at Ambala. When you weren't a fully ops guy, you had to slink in the corner. Here you went to the bar and thumped the table.
Visual to before the visualize. Just need 70, like your report time is southeast, Greenwich, east for the midway, and you'll select it.
By March of 71, when the clouds of war were beginning to darken, were you fully operational in the squadron by then?
Yes, actually, we were fully ops in February. And we were 2 aircraft leaders by March, April. Now, in March is the time when the crackdown in East Pakistan began and the refugees started coming across. But the war clouds actually started gathering in July, August. By
Much
then,
later.
not really
Right.
much later, 4 or 5 months later, it became clear to us. It must have been clear at the higher levels that we perhaps will have to go to war. But down at our levels, it became clear in August that yes, something is going to happen, because our ops location was Amritsar, and we started operating to Amritsar. Initially, we were told, hey guys, there are these huge big pillow tanks in which they've stored fuel. You see, fuel had to be stacked in big pillow tanks just in case, uh, say, supplies got disrupted for fuel. So they were stacked in fuel in these big pillow tanks. We got to go and consume the fuel. So four aircraft would get airborne. We'd go there, fly two sorties out of Amritsar, and come back. So it was a great day because you flew four sorties a day, one out, one back, and two sorties in Amritsar. So at that time, it became clear, hey, nobody just goes and does this because nothing. And work started happening in Amritsar in the sense that the ORPs were cleaned up and done up, bunkers had started getting dug up, and so on. So we knew that war is going to happen. By October, it was clear that it will happen. Only thing was when. That wasn't known. So by that time, we were already fully ops, two aircraft leaders, and we knew that no matter what happens, we are going to remain with the squadron and fight the war flying. Because the poor guys who were not fully ops,
Right.
they had to go as FACs and so on. Well, they also did a great job, but we were flying.
Right. Wonderful. So I know I interrupted you earlier when you were talking about beginning to talk about the systems on the NAT. So either we can go back to that or just continue and talk about what happened when the balloon actually went up.
Yeah, it was so simple. There were The systems were so simple. Electrical system with one generator, no standby. Something else with one main system, hydraulics main system, no standby. So that's how simple it was. And they kept it that way to keep it light. And that is how she was very powerful, light, and powerful. That's all I wanted to say about the systems.
Yeah, I've heard this story about competing on a scramble, and there was a flight commander who said, "I'll finish my cup of tea, jump out of my window, and I'll still be at 10,000 feet in a cap faster than any of the other aircraft."
Yes, yes.
Because you also had a cartridge start, isn't it? And so it was very quick to start up.
No, it didn't have a cartridge start. In fact, it had a start system, which is now used universally by all airlines. The simplest way of starting is you give high pressure air to turn the compressor turbine rotor, and electrical ignition to light up the fire and move the HP cock off so that fuel gets thrown in. That's exactly what used to happen when you jumped into the cockpit and put on the battery master and the inverters and fuel pumps. You asked the ground crew to give you air, and they gave you air. The engine started rotating at 500 RPM. You moved the HP cock forward, the fuel went in, and you pressed the igniters, and it would light up. So you got light up in 2 to 3 seconds, and the engine was at idle RPM at 11 to 12 seconds. So by the time they had disconnected and taken the trolley away at between 14 to 15 seconds, you were ready to taxi. And this aircraft was so light that it would run at idling RPM. And idling RPM wasn't enough to keep the generator charging. So you had to take the engine RPM up to get the generator charging, and the aircraft would start belting. So you had to bring it back and slow it down. And if you sat on the brakes too much, the brakes would heat up.
Oh
So
my.
it was the best thing to do for a ORP start. It was right next to the runway. You started up and leaped out. The average time from standing besides the cockpit to jump in and wheels up was in the order of 45 seconds. There were people like Kadu Kapila who'd done it in about 37 seconds. His was the record for a fastest scramble. We used to get between 42 to 45, 46 seconds.
One question I'm curious to ask you is you're about my height. Weren't you a tight fit in the cockpit of the Nat?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that question, because it started from day one when I went there, and Johnny Green himself was about my height. So he stood next to me. He said, "Listen, you're going to be touch and go." So he stood next to me and he said, "You're all right." But he said, "You got long legs." My leg, my legs are percentile 97, and my upper torso is percentile 67. So I have disproportionately long legs. So when you got into the cockpit, even when you pushed the, I didn't have to move the seat fully down, but I had to push the rudder pedals as far away as possible, and my shins would still touch the instrument panel while braking. So he looked at me and he said, "Look, stuff a map or something over there so it won't cut your shin." And nobody talked about what will happen when you eject.
Eject.
And one fine day, I did have to eject, and I was very worried I'd leave my legs behind, but fortunately, I didn't. But but I managed it, and it was a tight fit. Tight fit in the sense, in terms of height, in terms of girth, no, because there are lots of guys who were tight fit on the girth also.
Visual to Ford Midway. Just need 70, roger, report time southeast, connection for the Midway, and field selected.
So, what were preparations like for 1971?
Preparations began, and they began in right earnest.
And your role as a squadron would have probably been air defense?
It was only air defense, and towards the latter half, we started doing some offensive sweeps as well as strafing some ground targets. But to come back to our lead in up to the war, by about October, we'd started staying in Amritsar for a couple of days at a time till finally it stretched to weeks. And by November, the squadron actually had shifted over there. And the preparation, since we were air defense aircraft, we were on ORP. So we used to maintain a 4 aircraft ORP, two on cockpit readiness, two on 5 minute readiness, which when the war started, all 4 aircraft moved to cockpit readiness. So two were kept in the covered blast pens at the end, and they'd constructed two open blast pens right next to the dumbbell. So 2 aircraft were over there. Now, we had a great guy who was medically unfit, a coursemate of mine called Rajkumar Punia, who was a great guy in terms of electronics and so on. He fabricated part of equipment which the Indian Air Force never had. The airplane had a system called telebriefing, so you could connect a plug to the telebriefing socket in the aircraft, and you could get a full briefing from the radar sitting inside the cockpit. So he fabricated the grounds equipment part of it, and we used to sit in the cockpit and get a full briefing from there. And as days went by, he also connected us to Pakistan radio, so we could hear Pakistan radio, radar briefing, and everything. So when the tannoy went scramble, 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 we used to get our initial vectors on the telebrief. So whilst the engine was starting up, we got our full briefing to take off, which direction to head out to, what was our initial point, what was the altitude, what frequencies, all that came to us on telebriefing. And so we were ready. Our role mainly was cap and capping and escorts. We had 32 squadron, which was the Sukhoi squadron, which used to do the strikes. So we used to cap and escort. And later on, we started doing sweeps. So the general talk in the bar was we should change our squadron crest to a broom and a cap, because that's what we were doing, sweeping and capping.
So, just for the sake of the audience who are not familiar with some of these terms, just love to have you explain what is an ORP, what is a cockpit readiness, what is 5 minute readiness, and what's a cap, what's a sweep.
Okay, in that order, so I'll start off with what is an ORP. The full form of ORP is an operational readiness platform, which in various parts of the world is called things like quick reaction alert and so on. Two, it's generally always a pair. So a pair, the two aircraft are kept parked either in the blast pens or right besides the runway, with all checks completed and all switches kept on. The only switch that is kept off is the battery master. The pilot's seat is adjusted, the harness is adjusted, and the helmet is plugged in and connected on the side. And the moment the scramble is given, on the ground crew are trained properly. The guy standing right next to the cockpit on the other side is ready with the helmet. So the pilot jumps in, he pushes the helmet down on your head, you strap up and put the battery master on. The moment the guy with the starter trolley heard the inverters and fuel pumps come on, he gave you air. And then you moved the starting levers to start and ignite it. So the engine would start running while the guy who'd handed the helmet was moving away. And you just pulled the canopy shut and you were ready to move in about 15 to 18 seconds. And both aircraft moved out together to the aircraft, and you just did a quick check to see everything was okay. One quick click on the radio button to tell the other guy, I'm ready, and he started to roll. By that time, ATC had given clearance and they were repeating the same message that the radar controller gave you, which is your initial vectors, altitude, and frequency to go to.
So that's essentially vectoring you towards bogies that were heading towards that you were required to intercept. And
Absolutely right. Yeah. Depending upon their track, the radar controller would put you in such a way so he would have you correctly positioned for a combat if it were to develop. And a scramble in its classic terms is when the radar gives you the scramble orders. The orders are always scramble, 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 initial vector, so many degrees, initial altitude, so whatever the altitude was, and the first frequency. This is what the initial briefing comprised of. And so then you took off. And once you took off, you followed the radar vectors. So that is what ORP and a scramble is all about.
fascinating. And a cap, what is a cap and a sweep?
Okay. Yeah. So to be ready and available to take on any air defense mission, the completely ready place is right on top at the combat speed. So you got airborne and you went around the airfield in a racecourse pattern. So there were two aircraft on the opposite sides of the circle. Now that it forms like it's a cap on top of the airfield. That's why it's called a cap. Literally like a cap on top of the airfield. So you are at your combat speed, ready with the gun switches live. The only thing that was not live was the trigger. The trigger went live only when you put it onto a target and squeezed. Otherwise, all switches were live, the guns were armed, and you were ready to take on. And of course, the MiG 21s would have their missiles ready and armed. We never had any missiles.
Okay,
That's a
great.
cap. A was a sweep was a exercise where you took off and went into enemy territory, showed yourself up to draw out the enemy fighters. That is a very successful method of bringing up people, which is what happened in 65, and that is how so many Nats got kills on the Sabres. But in 71, the Pakis never picked up the gauntlet. We went out, we did a sweep, we did it at low levels, we did it at high levels, but the Pakis never came up.
Great. So, what was your experience once operations actually started? How many combat missions did you fly? Did you tell us some of the more interesting missions that?
Okay, I flew a total of 14 missions, and there were 8 of them were cap, and there were 6 sweeps. But in none of the missions did I see an enemy aircraft in the air. So
Oh,
we
wow.
went up, we did the sweeps, we did caps, but I never saw a single hostile aircraft in the air.
Oh. Were you ever scrambled?
Yes, we were scrambled. In fact, the last scramble I remember was at about 1600 hours on 17th of December. Ceasefire had been agreed to at 1900 hours, and we were scrambled. And we said, look, we've got to see an aircraft now because 3 hours from now, hostilities will cease. So we were airborne. And the radar said, look, we've got a target, but that's a little far away. So we are going to take the MiG 21s. The MiG 21s were manning the ORP on the other end of the runway. And there were two MiG 21s that scrambled. It was from 45 Squadron Detachment. They were Milind Shankar and Tejwan Singh. And they were taken out. And they made contact with the two Sabres. And the rest is history. They got after the Sabres. The Sabres threw in a turn, and the MiGs got caught in a classic sandwich, and we lost Tejwan Singh. Tejwan Singh ejected exactly an hour and 45 minutes before ceasefire.
Oh my.
So one of the Sabres got him. So that was the very last scramble.
And did you do any closer support missions? Any strafing?
No, no, Nats were never used in. We did a lot of strafing on the way back after a sweep if we never saw anything. And I remember seeing a train on a railway track, so we strafed the train. That's about it, but nothing more than that. So
Excellent.
I just never saw an enemy aircraft in the air. But we saw enemy aircraft on the ground, and there's one tale I would like to narrate. This was on the afternoon of the 5th of December, around 1400 hours. The CO and I, we had to shift back and forth. We had three shifts of cockpit readiness during the day. It was from 6 to 10, 10 to 2, and 2 to 6. So I was on that 10 to 2 shift. We had finished, the 2 o'clock shift was over. The two people on the as a pair were my CO, that's Johnny Green, and myself. So he came in the jeep to pick me up from the pen. I'd handed over, the next guy had gotten into the cockpit. We came out and we were driving towards the mess when we saw two silver specks out on, not on the horizon, but coming straight towards Amritsar. If you look at the map, Lahore to Amritsar, the road railway line is like a straight line. You can actually put a ruler and draw a straight line. That's how straight it is. And we saw these two specks. And as they put on bank, we saw there were two starfighters
Wow.
and gleaming silver. And as they came closer, they pulled up, and a couple of seconds later, we heard the distinctive vroom of the Vulcan cannon firing. They were firing at the Amritsar radar, which is in the city. They did one pass there, the Amritsar SU ACAC opened up. We could see the puffs firing. And they continued with the turn, and they came straight over the airfield, and they were must have been doing between 450 to 500 knots. And they went over the airfield, and the airfield ACAC opened up. And they both had reheats going on their engines. Suddenly, we saw right above us the reheat of one aircraft go off, trailing black smoke, ejected, inverted, and that aircraft went into the ground. And the pilot's parachute deployed, and he fell just outside the airfield. When I say just outside, it's about 800 yards outside the airfield perimeter. So we were driving to the mess, which was right next to the perimeter fence. So Johnny Green told me, he said, Ajit, go get that guy before the villagers get him. So we went up to the fence. He lowered one strand of barbed wire with his feet. He pulled the other one out, and he said, get out of here. So I got out, but before me, there was one more army infantry jawan, because security of the airfield was looked after by the army. He'd already got out and he was running. So I ran after him. So we were sprinting towards the guy, and I was in my overalls, and the thoughts that were going through my mind is, I said, I hope the villagers don't mistake me for the Paki.
Did you have any small arms on you? Did you have any weapon on you?
Yeah, we're supposed to have carried a pistol, but I never carried one because it would have had to be put in the pocket next to my shin. And with my long legs, I didn't want to leave my legs behind, so I never carried a weapon with me. So we were just about 20 yards from him when he started. He'd unlocked his parachute and he was getting up. And the army Jawan was about 5 or 10 yards ahead of me, no questions asked. With his rifle, he hit him in his midriff. So the guy was falling down. As he was going down, he gave him one hit on his head, so he collapsed again. We went, picked him up, and as he was getting up, the jeep from the Air Force station came. We picked him up, put him inside. His wing was on his overall with press buttons, stitch buttons. So it was hanging loose with one. So I took it off, and I still have that wing. And this was
Oh,
Amjad Hussain.
Oh my goodness. Wow. That's a little memento that I hope you have framed and preserved nicely.
I still have it. I still have it with me. And so he was taken in the jeep, brought to the airport, and of course, whatever had to be done was done. And it's a good thing we got him because he wasn't beaten up or roughed up by the villagers. And uh, the evening when IL-14 came from Delhi, picked him up and took him off to Delhi.
Did you give him a nice cup of tea?
He must have had a cup of tea. We couldn't get to him after that because by the time I got back to the air, the jeep had taken him away. So now I had to walk my way back, crawl in from under the fence,
Oh,
lunch and so on. But that's about it. And that same night, a Canberra B-57 was shot down by ACAC. That was shot down about 8 miles away from the airfield. We saw that also happen. So the Pakistanis lost two aircraft that night, that day, sorry.
yeah. A starfighter on reheat is a pretty fast beast, and for the ACAC to get it is a very, very impressive achievement.
Apparently, he'd already been hit at he sustained damage over the SU. The SU ACAC had also got him.
Mm.
And whatever it was now, whether it was deterioration of his systems here or he was hit again, only he'll be able to tell us. But he ejected over the airfield or just past the airfield.
Individuals to before you evacuate. Just need 70, roger, report time southeast, connection, ejection for Midwest and field selected.
So let's maybe wrap this section on the Gnat, which your story of your ejection. What happened and what was that experience like?
I don't know whether to laugh or otherwise, but this was on 3rd of April 73. Uh, we were called out to say, listen, there's going to be an Iraqi delegation, Iraqi Air Force delegation coming here tomorrow, and we want to show them a demonstration scramble. So that was one of the high water marks of a Gnat, because no aircraft would, from standing outside, could get airborne in about 45-50 seconds. So there were two of us. Alan Templeton was my leader, and I. We were told, okay, go get ready. So we got ready, and the aircraft were parked on the ORP. And the AOC at that time was Air Commodore Jock Lloyd. He had a stopwatch in his hand. He came, stood there, and he said, "Go." So we both sprinted, jumped into the cockpit, started up, and took off. And in about 45-47 seconds, we were airborne, which was not bad. And the aircraft were clean. So nothing like a clean aircraft for a good combat. We quickly got up to 20,000 feet, did two combat one versus one situation. We were running a little short of fuel. We came in, broke down with. The leader called up three greens. When I lowered, I saw two greens. And the one which was up was the left undercarriage, left main. The left main is connected mechanically to the ailerons drooping down to flap position because the Gnat never had flaps.
Right.
When you raised the gear, the drooped ailerons would go up, and when you lowered the gear, the drooped ailerons would come down to flaperon position. And it gave you a huge trim change of 8 to 9 degrees. And we were clean. So, high wing anhedral aircraft, the manufacturer prohibited you from belly landing the aircraft. Though guys have landed with drop tanks, but we were clean. It didn't even have drop tanks. So the left undercarriage wouldn't come down. So I did a flyby. This is the undercarriage is up. So I tried everything, turning with high G and so on and so forth. And with every passing minute, the fuel was dropping. Finally, when I had about 200 pounds of fuel, I had made some 3 or 4 attempts, nothing would work. So they said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I have no choice, go to eject." So they said, "Eject." So I turned the aircraft in a easterly, southeasterly direction and climbed to 10,000 feet, which I reached there in about 30 seconds. I still had 50 pounds of fuel, so now I was wondering whether I should wait for the fuel to run dry and then eject, or or eject now. But I decided to eject while everything was okay. So I trimmed the aircraft and pulled the handle. And there was a big whoosh. When I knew the canopy had gone, cold air rushing in, but then nothing happened. I knew there was a 1.25 second delay between canopy going to seat firing. That's to give you enough separation from the canopy. So I said, wait, 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 wait. Then it seemed like I'd waited 1 year. I opened my eyes. From the corner of my eye, I could see the DME showing a distance of 10 miles. I said, oh God, the seat is not working. I was about to leave the face blind when the seat fired. And I went hurtling into the air. And I tightened my parachute harness and so tight that I couldn't. It was as if somebody was holding me from my trousers up like this. But anyway, it took me about 10.5 minutes to come down and banged into a cultivated field. So while coming down, I could see lots of wells and high tension cables. So my fear was that I shouldn't land across a high tension cable
Right.
with one leg on either side, or that I shouldn't fall straight into a well, neither of
Right.
which happened. And then the villagers came, picked me up, and so on. So the back did hurt a little bit, but other than that, I had no other problem. My shoe had got ripped off, so my one foot was hurt and bleeding. But anyway, so I hobbled and walked. So then the guys got a bullock cart. They said, sit on this. So sat on the bullock cart, went to a village where, in typical Punjab Haryana style, there are the cots which are called manjis. So they made me sit on one of the manjis, gave me one big glass full of milk to drink. And then I heard two old Sardars talking between themselves. In Punjabi, he said, should we give him a small peg? So I said, I said, that's all that's needed. And whilst all this was going on, one Sardar drove up on a scooter. So I asked him, I said, if you could drop me up to the GT road, I'll perhaps hitch a ride with someone. So he was most offended. He said, nay, nay, I'm a MES contractor. I have a pass to go into the Air Force station. So with my parachute between the two of us, he took me. We drove up to the Air Force station. The gates were shut. I said, look, guys, I want to go in. They're not an emergency, so the gates are shut. I said, look, I am the emergency. Nobody was willing to listen.
Oh my goodness.
Finally, one warrant officer saw me and recognized me. Ah, so you're the guy. So he opened the door, we went in. There was nobody in the squadron. My leader, Alan Templeton, who was also the adjutant, was sitting at his table, busy signing away some papers. I said, hey, why did you leave me behind? So he looked up as if he'd seen a ghost. He said, where have you come from? I said, I've come back now. So
On a
he gave us
scooter.
a car a cup of tea. And I said, it's time to let people know. Ah. So I said, time to let people know I'm back. So we called up the ATC. The standard reply was, there is an emergency, no incoming call, and bang, the phone went down. So we dialed again, the same answer. Till finally, after 5 attempts, we told him, hey, listen, I am the emergency, I'm back here. So then they said, oh, you're back. So by this time, what had happened was they requisitioned two Gnat helicopters were going from Saharanpur to Chandigarh, or maybe the other way around. So they got those two guys to come and land, and everybody got on board. And the helicopter pilots were saying, listen, the fields are all dug up. We'll just take a first aid team and go and pick this guy up. But nobody listened to it. So anyway, they all got airborne. So there was nobody on the Air Force station. The doctors, the flight commanders, everybody had gone away on the helicopters.
Where was the Iraqi delegation in the meantime?
That was the following day. This was practice.
This is
They
practice.
were to come the following day. So this is practice. So then we called up the sick quarters. Same answer. There's an emergency, no incoming calls. Finally, they got to know that the emergency is sitting here. Then when the helicopters landed, the SMO came out, the CO came down, and by this time it was lunchtime. So the SMO was a great guy. He said, listen, you should not be walking. But he said, you walked. You've been carried on the back across one nala by a guy. You sat on a bullock cart. You've come these 20 kilometers on a scooter. So whatever damage has had to happen has happened. So he said, we'll take you home. You have lunch with your wife, and then we'll take you to the hospital. So that's exactly what they did. But they simply could not, the court of inquiry couldn't figure out why the undercarriage.
Wow. How long before you returned to flying status?
Oh, other than this injury on my foot, which was sutured, there was nothing. So they just waited till the sutures came out, and 10 days later I was flying. There was nothing. I had no injuries other than the injury on my foot.
Individuals who were on that before you evacuate. Just need 70, Roger, report time southeast, connection for the midway, and field selected.
You've had a lot of experience on the Jaguar, and you had a MiG
Yeah.
21 phase in between. But anything about the transition to the MiG from the Gnat, a simple aircraft, to a very complex, very fast, very high performance aircraft, the MiG 21, and then the journey to the Jaguar? And where did test pilot school happen in between those two?
So shall I take a couple of minutes to run it in chronological order?
That would be amazing. Thank you.
You see, in the days I'm talking of, early 70s, every guy was going and flying a MiG 21, and the guys who were left behind on the Nats, it was as if you guys are the cast offs of the Air Force. So, so, so when I said, hey guys, what about us? They're no, no, every guy who's got more than 350, 400 hours on the transonic goes to supersonic. I said, look, we've already clocked 550. Can't be. So I said, you look at your own returns and see. They saw. And immediately they posted me to 7th Squadron. Now, 7 had converted to Type 96s. That was the MiG 21M, but the
Right.
MF version, which was equipped with the R13 engines. So this was a different beast altogether. It firstly, it was a little fatter, but the engine was a little more powerful. But it had a gyro gun sight, which the old Type 77 did not have. This had a radar which was mounted down below, a little more powerful radar, which never worked, which is a separate issue. And it had an internal gun, which the Type 77 did not have. The Type 77 had to carry a podded gondola underneath, and this had four wing pylons. So this was a and a centerline pylon. So this was a big beast. And so we went there. It was a brand new aircraft,
Where was the 7th Squadron at that time?
Chandigarh. So I moved from Ambala to Chandigarh by road on my motorcycle with wife on my pillion and our daughter Geetanjali between us. That's how we moved to Chandigarh. And 7th Squadron was very, very dynamic and full of people, full of great guys. Flying began, I mean, the MCF began on day 3 of our arrival.
So, for our audience who don't know what MCF is, if you could just quickly.
It is the ground school. Ground school in the Air Force in those days was called MCF. MCF stood for Mobile Conversion Flight. So ground school began on day 3. Flying began soon thereafter. So it was good fun. But in 7 or 8 months from that time, the Air Force posted me to the instructor school to become a flying instructor, which I did. And at the end of the instructor school, for the first time in our life, guys said, hey, where do you guys want to get posted? So I said, are you serious? You guys are asking us, where do we want to get posted? And the three choices were Bidar to fly the HT2, or AFA to fly the Kiran, or Hakimpet to fly that unknown new aircraft called the Iskra.
Uh,
Now, everyone had various, agendas. And for me, the agenda was very simple. I wanted to go and live in a city, and I said, if I get to fly a new aircraft, great. So I said, Hakimpet. So guys told me, idiot, you don't know what that aircraft is. You got to sit tandem. You can't see the pupil up front. You won't know what he's doing. You'll never be able to fly. I said, I got to live in a city. So since I stood first on the course, I got my first choice. I went to Hakimpet, and we flew the Iskra.
so just for the audience who don't know the Iskra, just if you could quickly, I think it was a Polish trainer aircraft that we had got
It
for
is.
our
It is a Polish
jet
trainer,
conversion. Mm.
tandem seating, uh, one of the most delightful aircraft to fly. And visibility from the back is quite grim, but you get used to it. The cockpit air conditioning, like all aircraft from the Eastern world, works only in the hottest mode. So, but, but it was a delightful aircraft to fly, and instructional was by talking, but you spoke to the guy with something called a laryngophone. It is tied to your throat. It's a throat
Right.
mic, and so the voice comes out very guttural. So after
Ah,
you finish telling the pupil that he comes from a family of long line of bachelors, he turns around and says, "What did you say, sir?"
oh my.
so, so, so within the first few days, we realized instructional needs to be kept only to instructional and down to the bare minimum of words. But it was such a nice aircraft. And if we wanted 16 aircraft for flying in the morning, the engineering staff would line up 24 for safe measure.
Oh my goodness.
And I flew 2 years over there, 1,000 hours on the Iskra, and I went as a category C QFI. In a year and a half, I upgraded to A2 and I pushed off to a MiG 21 squadron again in Adapur.
Wow. So again, for those of our audience who don't know what these things are, an A2, A1 are the top-rated qualified flying instructors in the Air Force, and it's amazing that you did that in a year and a half.
And it was back to a MiG 21 squadron in Adampur. Adampur was a very dynamic station. It had four MiG 21 squadrons there, and it was full of life. Full of life meant flying began at the crack of dawn on Monday, and on Friday evening, everything stopped. Saturday, Sunday was holiday time to rejuvenate, and Monday it started all over again. So for a year and a half, I was in 101 Squadron. We did a lot of flying there. And from there, I was posted to do an instructional tenure in Tikrit in Iraq. Now, Tikrit, as everybody knows, it's the home of Saddam Hussein. And when we reached there in July of 79, for the first time in their history, they had a peaceful handover of power where the President Hassan al Bakr handed over to Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein was the president, and for the first 1 year, peace prevailed till September of 1980. He went to war with Iran. And there we flew the L-39, which was a Czech trainer. L-39, the Albatross. And to be fair, I don't think there is any basic jet trainer as well designed as the L-39. Beautiful aircraft with the outside air conditioning, with the outside temperature around 48 degrees. Inside, you could keep it at 24. And it had a powerful fan engine, very nice systems, very nice cockpit layout, and it was a stepped up cockpit, so you looked over the head of the pupil. And so 2 years we spent there flying the L39 L39. I came back onto the staff of flying instructors school in Tambaram, and I knew it was a holding pattern because I was to go to staff college, but before the orders for staff college came the orders for the test pilot school.
That was a
And
tough
I
call.
moved from instead of doing one year course where studies are by the way and most important is dramatics and writing and so on. I was here when 24 hours in a day were 24 hours too short. We wished a day had 48 hours.
Individuals who were on time before the individual. Just need 70, Roger, report time southeast, connection, for midway, and field selected.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Join me again next week as I pick up the threads again with Group Captain Agtey and the rest of his career, becoming a test pilot and then doing some very interesting test flying work on the Jaguar, raising the first Jaguar squadron that used the indigenously developed Darin system, and also some interesting work that he did on fitting a new set of engines to the AN-32. In the meantime, sign up for updates at blueskiespodcast.com. There you'll find links to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also write to us with your comments, questions, suggestions, and feedback from the website or to blueskies@prganapati.com. Subscribe to the podcast on any podcasting platform such as Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and even on YouTube. If you like what you heard, share it with your friends, give us a rating in your favorite podcasting app, and write us a review. It will help other people find us. I want to give my thanks to Saurav Chordia for our logo and Prithvik for the music. I want to reiterate that all the views expressed here are personal, and this podcast has not been approved by or reviewed by the Air Force, Ministry of Defense, or any branch of the government. In the meantime, stay safe and Jai Hind.